Lots of things you have to remember here. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maggie Dixon. I'm the Home Visiting Coordination Initiative Development Coordinator at Prevent Child Abuse New York. We're very pleased to start back up this webinar series. We took a brief break over the summer months. We were regularly offering these webinars for a while, but we're happy to be back. If you're unfamiliar, the Home Visiting Coordination Initiative is a project that was funded under the Preschool Development Birth Through 5 grant. Although that grant funding has ended, we are continuing the project in terms of the webinar series monthly, website maintenance, and convening our backbone organizations throughout the state on a somewhat regular basis. And the Home Visiting Coordination Initiative project is intended to increase access to and availability of home visiting services to families throughout the state by increasing coordination and collaboration within these programs and services. So we can convene stakeholders from all over the state to have conversations with home visiting programs, with program administrators, other early childhood professionals, parents, etc. So we have been very fortunate to have some of our stakeholders offer presentations for us throughout this webinar series. That's been going on for a few years now, and we're pleased to be joined today by one of our stakeholder partners, the Children's Agenda in Rochester. We're joined by Pete Navazny. He's the policy director at the Children's Agenda. I'll let Pete introduce himself in just a moment and explain a little bit about the organization. Before I do that, I am going to just ground us for a moment in the plan that we have for the day. So as I mentioned, Pete is going to be sharing some academic material and information about the report that TCA just published. I've linked to it, hyperlinked to it here in these slides, but we will send resources after today's session. So you can go ahead and take a peek at that report. I'll also drop a link in the chat. After Pete speaks, he provides the current landscape, a perspective of the current landscape of housing instability, specific to Rochester, but also statewide. We'll then move into hopefully some participation from our participants today to help guide the conversation. The report posits some state level measures that can limit the harms of housing instability, which I know Pete will dive into a little bit, but we also hope to have a broader conversation today about the role that home visitors can have right now and in their communities to hear issues and needs and concerns from the families that you work with every day. So we'll have a moment here to have our participants share about opportunities in their communities and successes that they've had, ideas. Finally, we'll close with a brief discussion around some broader recommendations and considerations before closing. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and Pete will go ahead and share his slide deck. And please drop any questions or anything else in the chat box, and I'll do my best to monitor throughout today.
Great. Thanks so much, Maggie. Hi, everyone. Pete Navazny, and as said, Director of Policy at the Children's Agenda. And I'll go a little bit into the Children's Agenda in a moment when I pull up my presentation. But we are a children's policy and advocacy organization located here in Rochester, and we've been around since 2004. So we're I guess reaching adulthood, and we work on a broad range of issues. So let me get that pulled up and go to slide. All right, Maggie, someone else give me a thumbs up if you can see everything. And all right, so this was a report, and I'll dig into it a little bit, and I definitely want to leave room for a lot of conversation. This is a report we worked on over the summer. And I'll call out my colleague Shannon Mullen, who's also here today, who helped out with a lot of the report as well. But look specifically at housing instability among Rochester City School District children, and then kind of pulled in some other data information where we were able. And so it really focuses on kids in the school system, which I know is a different sort of focus than this group, but I think a lot of the challenges that families face with instability, certainly when kids are in kindergarten, first, second, third grade, it could also be applied when they're younger. And in a lot, and I'll get into a little bit, there's evidence that suggests that families with younger children experience even more instability. But we just didn't have the data for young children, which is a big policy issue on its own, that we often lack a lot of good information at a systems level as to what's happening with kids, particularly before they enter the school system. So a little bit on the children's agenda, and some folks may be familiar with us, but we are, again, a children's policy and advocacy organization that we keep a close eye on what's happening here in Rochester in our community, but we also get involved in a lot of state level policy making and advocacy opportunities. And broadly speaking, I'm not going to read every word on any of these slides, hopefully, so I'll give people a chance to look this over themselves. But broadly focused, we have like 4 kind of major focus areas: early childhood, education, health and safety is kind of how it's described. It includes a lot of other things, including maternal child health, and then child poverty. And we try to be cognizant of the fact that racial inequities are persistent throughout every one of these systems, and it's incumbent on all of us to do what we can to not just work on and promote policies that work for every family, but with a particular focus on reducing racial inequality in our society. We do this through a variety of different ways. We do a fair bit of research and policy analysis, and that's mostly my focus at the Children's Agenda. But that incorporates a lot of different things. But then we also do direct advocacy with policymakers, whether it's local school board members or city council members or county executives, people in county government, or state level policymakers. And then we're very active in the community as well in trying to advance things that work for, particularly in our community in Rochester, things that work for kids and families through collaborative systems building. And recognizing that we've been growing a bit lately, and which is great that we have some new folks at the Children's Agenda, but we are far too small to do anything really significant on our own. So just a little background on this report. Again, as I mentioned, it focuses on the Rochester City School District for a lot of reasons. One of those reasons is that the Rochester City School District is one of the most high needs school districts in New York State. About 90% of children in the RCSD are categorized as economically disadvantaged. That means that it's sort of like the successor measure of free and reduced lunch, but basically nearly all families are connected to some form of public assistance or Medicaid, things like that. They have some encounters with the public assistance system. And child poverty in the whole in Rochester, it's been down a little bit recently, but it always hovers around 50%, which is one of the highest child poverty rates in the country of any city of a decent size. And the report, I'm going to go into the recommendations very briefly later, recognizing that we're going to talk about those things and maybe some other things. We really wanted to target the recommendations for this report at New York State, what the state should do, recognizing, though, that there are things that the city of Rochester can do. There are things that Monroe County can do. There's things that local foundations can do. There's things that nonprofits that serve families can do. But we wanted to focus on state level policies for this report, just to kind of focus something. And in particular, a lot of things are framed towards the Child Poverty Reduction Advisory Council, which is a newly constituted body at the state level, which is charged with making recommendations to the governor to reduce child poverty by 50% in the next 10 years. So in addition to a lot of data analysis in the report, we were also really fortunate to be able to talk to families and document their experiences with housing instability. And there's a number of these stories throughout the report. And I'm going to go into a lot of data. And I think people in this meeting know this through your work and everything. But it's sometimes difficult to get out of the abstract level of 1,800 families or children experience homelessness in this year, or you have 100 and some odd thousand families who are experiencing some housing instability in a period of time. But in reality, that's a different circumstance for every one of those families that's brought on by, maybe there's some common themes throughout, but there are unique particulars to every one of those family stories. And it's really important for me in my work, again, because I deal a lot with data and big picture stuff like that, to not lose sight of the fact that that families are undergoing some real challenges here, and it's deeply personal, and it's deeply affected by some personal circumstances that they are encountering. So I just wanted to, I'll give people a moment to read one of those stories that we included in the report here. And I think there are themes of what Tiana and her family experienced that are present for a lot of families, but I just wanted to kind of to call that out, that I'm certainly recognizing that this is not just data, it's real people's lives, and real challenges that people have faced.
I will quickly mention, thank you for that reminder too, Pete. That's a very important point. That folks have the ability, closed captioning services are on. I forgot to mention at the beginning of this session. Folks have the ability, you should have, to zoom in on your screen. So when you read this case study, it's, I believe, if you hover on the control panel on the bottom, there might be a zoom function, or just physically like zooming on your keypad if you're having trouble reading the text.
And you can also find this and all the other stories we include in the report itself. And that's not just a plug to read it, because it's spent a lot of time writing it, but there is a lot of good info in there. So I will I'll move on though. Okay, so just big picture, just trying to get to some of the that data and some of the findings. We did like a literature review in the report, looking at what a lot of studies have found happens to families when they experience housing instability. Specifically for this report, it was students, and what happens to kids when they when their housing situation changes. And also, we want to recognize families' housing changes for lots of reasons. Sometimes they're good reasons. They got, mom got a raise. They can afford a better apartment in a part of town that maybe they're more comfortable in, or is near some things that are important to them in their lives. So not all moves are bad, right? Lots of moves are good. But there is a lot of data to suggest that a lot of the moves that families in Rochester are experiencing that contribute to this really high rate that we're going to talk about are not positive moves. And in general, in the aggregate, housing instability, frequent movements are associated with lower graduation rates, more behavioral mental health challenges for kids, poor mental health, that sense of transition or abrupt change, and the lack of certainty about sort of the way that a kid becomes comfortable with their living environment, and the routine that they're in, has a lot of negative outcomes associated with it. And again, that doesn't mean every child goes through that, but on the whole, instability of housing is not good for kids. And I think folks here know that, but there's a lot of research that backs that up. And unfortunately, between these 2 years, 38% of Rochester City School District students either switched schools within the district, changed addresses, or left the district. And that's a big piece of it as well, is that what we saw in the data was that there are a lot of families who sort of coming and going in the school district. And so housing is one issue, but then so too could be, well, they could have moved out of the school district physically, and that's why they're no longer there, or they could have switched to a charter school or something else. But then there's also a lot of switching schools within the district, even outside of the transition grades. If a school's K-5, and so when they go to 6th grade, well, of course they're going to change. But if you even exclude those, there are a lot of kids and families who are switching schools. And so if your home life is unstable, and then you're also experiencing a lot of movement in terms of your school setting, that can just be really unsettling for kids. And there was a wide range of mobility within the district. The lowest rate was 21% and the highest was 49%. And we didn't want to get into like test scores and things like that, but in general, the schools with the highest rates of mobility were the schools that were more likely to be under like receivership status with the state, with lower performance on standardized tests, higher rates of absenteeism, things like that. And then COVID really upset a lot of things, including good data collection on student homelessness and things like that. So in the most recent years, data is not available yet. So we look back to 2018-19, but the rate of homelessness among students in the Rochester City School District was about 8 times greater than it was in the surrounding suburbs, showing there's a real difference in the experience that kids, their home situation, and particularly that circumstance of becoming homeless between the city and its more affluent surrounding suburbs. I'll jump through this one fairly quickly, but this is another way to look at it. There was, again, 38% of kids had some kind of change, but then 33% of kids had either left the district or changed addresses. We didn't include some of the other movements because it's a slightly different universe of kids because of excluding grades of transition. But this, I think, is particularly important for this group. On the whole, there were higher rates of children changing addresses in the younger years in Rochester than as they got older. Not huge differences. I think you see kind of a higher rate K through 7, although a little bit higher in the earlier years, and then it starts to fall off as kids get a bit older. But that's consistent with a lot of other data that's out there that indicates that younger families, families with younger parents or newly formed families, things like that, have more instability, which I know this group could speak to more than I can. But there's also, particularly with data and research around child poverty, a lot of data showing that experiencing poverty as a young child is more harmful long term for kids, unfortunately, than later in childhood, and yet younger kids are more likely to be in poverty. And so it's bad for everyone, but it's particularly bad for younger kids. And it seems like instability in housing is, again, particularly high in the younger years. Also in Rochester, and this includes both changes in address and kids leaving the district. You saw disparities by race and ethnicity, with multiracial Black and Hispanic students with higher rates of mobility than white and Asian students. I should say that Rochester City School District is also about 90% Black and Latino. So those are the 2 biggest groups in the district. But even within the smaller number of white and Asian students, you did see a difference between their rates of mobility and others. And then we had a lot of data in there, and I'm just kind of touching on a few things in the report just to give some context. We looked at the percentage of families experience. We looked at like housing burden data that Shannon pulled together, so I could defer to her, I suppose, on this. But the Housing and Urban Development at the federal level, they set a standard of a family is housing burdened. The cost of housing is greater than they can really bear if they pay more than 30% of their income on housing. And there's a really big difference in Rochester and many other places like Buffalo and Syracuse, as you can see on the screen, between the percentage of renters who are housing burdened and the percentage of homeowners. And you have rising rents in lots of communities around New York. So a lot of families are experiencing those rent increases, year to year in a really difficult way. Whereas families who even hold a mortgage, well, if that mortgage is for 20, 30 years, they've bought themselves some rent control in a certain type of way over time. And also, renter families are more likely to be low income, more likely to have, more economic insecurity. But rising costs of rent and the fact that their incomes are low result in really high rates of renters being rent burdened all across New York State, and certainly in the community that we live in here in Rochester. and then looking at homelessness, which there's lots of families that end up being homeless, experiencing homelessness, that don't get captured by this, right? If this is the like officially measured by the school districts and the McKinney-Vento status, some people may be familiar with. So if anything, this undercounts. But in 2018-19, 6% of New York State students experienced homelessness. That was much higher in New York City. New York City has a higher rate of student homelessness than really any other part of the state. And it's, as people know, the biggest part of the state. And so that drives the statewide average up quite a bit. And again, in suburban Monroe County with 75,000 students, you had a 1% homelessness rate, and in Rochester you had over almost 2,500 students were homeless at some point during that year. That could be anything from a child and family being in a shelter or doubling up on a family member's couch for a period of time, but they left their home and did not have a new permanent residence. I think a lot of people are familiar with this, but during the COVID pandemic, there was eviction moratoriums. There was a lot of assistance that was provided to families for through various pandemic relief, whether it was enhanced unemployment or help getting out from under rent burdens, things like that. You did see a really steep decline in eviction filings during 2020 and 2021. And then they bounced back up in 2022. And so while we don't have a lot of data on student homelessness for 2022, it's, these trends are not good. And they're probably indications that the rates of students and families that become homeless are bouncing back up to the pre-pandemic levels, which is really, really unfortunate. And so we included a couple different counties there, Monroe, where I live, and some similar counties, Erie, which is Buffalo, and Onondaga, which is Syracuse. This was not part of our report here, but I wanted to include it again because of this group's interest. This was the New York Times about 2 weeks ago. I could try to dig up the article and put it in the chat after I'm done presenting. But there was a big analysis done by some folks out of Princeton. Matthew Desmond, who people may be familiar with, who's a well-known sociologist who's really studied housing instability and evictions and things like that. They looked at, among other things, evictions by age group, and the percentage of families experiencing evictions, and going through that process. And it showed that very young children birth to 4, had the highest rate of facing eviction, even if you account for like what percentage of them are in rental and all that. So little kids are much more likely to be facing, and their families are much more likely to be facing eviction than any other age group. And yet we actually looked a little bit for some of this data while we were pulling together our report, and it's outside the scope of this discussion, but the court system, no one really tracks whether there are kids, and certainly not young children, in homes that are facing eviction. So there's a lot of data that's out there now on filings and how much people are behind on rent and the proceedings of a case and all those things. But in the court system, there's no flag for, oh, there's kids under 18, or there's kids under 5, or here's the size of the family that's facing eviction. It's really between a landlord and the person who signed the lease. And babies and toddlers aren't signing leases, and so they're sort of invisible to the court system when dealing with things like eviction. That may not be the case with a particular judge or a particular proceeding, but on the whole, for the data, we just have really bad data on the ways that this system of eviction and families facing this housing instability, kind of who's it happening to, what their experiences are, any of that. It's just not something that's tracked right now. So I'll stop after this, but we did have a bunch of recommendations in the report. Again, they're focused on like state government and state policymakers, which I'm going to breeze through really quickly. If people want me to dig into like what the public assistance shelter allowance is, I'm more than happy to, because it's really bad. But most of these recommendations were focused on the ways that state lawmakers could ensure that families have more resources to stay in the home that they are in, or find better housing for themselves. Kids are expensive. Kids need more rooms. Families that are growing need more space. Little kids don't pay their way. There's a lot of reasons why families with children are particularly housing unstable, but there are things that we can do from a policy perspective, like expanding the state's child tax credit, like ensuring that some of these public assistance programs that are meant to help maintain families in housing are funded to the level that they need to be, so that the per family amount is sufficient, or that if we have wait lists for things like Section 8, well, there's things that New York State could do to supplement that program, and that families who are going through proceedings like this can get certain protections and help to hopefully remain in their housing, and if not, to find that next best place to live. And then also the fact that we have a growing shortage of housing in New York, all over the state, certainly downstate, but parts of upstate as well, and rising homeownership costs and difficulties finding rental apartments. That's something a lot of people have experienced over the past couple of years, but lowest income families feel that pinch the most. So when housing costs are increasing and there's a scarcity of homes, that the people with the least resources have the hardest time finding someplace that's suitable to live. And so finding some way to expand the availability of housing needs to be a key priority of the state. So I'm going to turn it back over to Maggie here, but really looking forward to the discussion today, and hope I was able to sort of generalize some of this to the things that this group is working on.
Thank you so much, Pete. It was a wonderful high level overview of state level measures that can limit the harms of housing instability, and a highlight of some opportunities for continued advocacy, particularly around tenants' rights and protections for tenants. I was going to play this off and just say, oh, I meant to do this, or this is the order of the PowerPoint, but however, I was meant to do this in the beginning of the session, but we had hoped to take a quick poll, which I will launch here in just a moment, to get an idea of where folks are joining us from around the state. And although this conversation, as Pete highlighted, is specific to data collected in the Rochester Finger Lakes region, unfortunately, I think everyone here knows that these issues are being faced by families all throughout the state, and we wanted to hear kind of from home visitors, where you are and what you're seeing from families, if anything, in terms of housing instability, homelessness, lack of affordable housing in your community. So we'll share these results in just one moment, but I'm watching the live results, and majority of folks are joining from Western New York region, Finger Lakes, Mid-Hudson, and New York City are okay. It's been around for about a minute, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results. If you are able to, at this moment, it would be wonderful if you could rename yourself so we could see what county you're joining from or what region you're joining from, just so when we kind of ask you to chat in anything, we can kind of see where you're from in the state, in terms of any county specific projects or anything going on. So I'll stop sharing these results, but we always have a really nice kind of spread of people joining from throughout the state. So just wanted to open it up. We invite you to chat in, or you can unmute if you're comfortable. Just wanted to ask home visitors, advocates that are joining, what are you seeing in terms of housing for families that you work with in your community? And then also, how is any of these conditions, how are they manifesting in children's behaviors, the relationships between children and families in your community?
Hi, my name is Nikita Duncan. I'm a family advocate with Astor Head Start in Poughkeepsie, which is Mid-Hudson region. We are swamped with houseless families. Like we only have 2 homeless shelters that can cater to families, and they're always full. Um, so we have it's just a revolving door, and the as fast as the Section 8 opens up, families only have a certain amount of time to get an apartment, like secured with their voucher. But a lot of these landlords are asking for a realtor fee, first month's rent, and security. So an apartment here, like a 1-bedroom apartment in my area, is like $2,300, right? So you're asking for $6,000 up front for a family, whether they have Section 8 or not. So it's like, okay, so we do have some resources. We have, you know what I mean? But there's not enough. Like there's not enough money to go around. So if someone has no home, if they're living in a shelter and they can't get a job because the jobs are so far away and in relative like proximity to where the homeless shelters are that house the families, they're not in the inner city of Poughkeepsie. So it's not like they can have access to jobs. So it's like this big circle of frustration. And what we're seeing with the children here is they have no routine, they have no schedule, they have no discipline, and they have because they have no stability. And when I say discipline, it's like even as far as asking a child to come on, let's walk up the stairs, and they fall out, and it's just like asking them to do anything is like they can't focus because they don't know if they're gonna go home tonight, if they're going to go back to the shelter, or if they're getting kicked out of the shelter, because that's happening because the parents are angry and frustrated and desperate, and they're arguing with other parents who are angry and frustrated and desperate, and they're not getting kicked out. So it's like their bad situation goes to worse. So, and the children see it all. So we're seeing cognitive delays. We're seeing developmental delays as far as like potty training and like things like that. We're seeing all sorts of delays, and certain school districts ask for original documentation to get them into the school districts, right? And a lot of these families have nothing. They don't have clothes, let alone original paperwork. So it's like this big mess. So that's what we're seeing. That's what we're working with. That sounded really bad.
No, thank you for sharing. And Nikita, everyone is echoing, unfortunately, what you're saying, in different regions throughout the state. Lack of, first of all, over capacity, homeless shelters. And I know, Pete, there's one of the case studies, I don't know if it was the one that you put up on the screen, of Tiana, and her ability to, after staving off her eviction due to the earned income tax credit, there was some domestic violence issues, and she was able to get into a homeless shelter. But again, although homeless shelters are a temporary, I don't mean to say solution, but a place for families to go, it's still turmoil and instability for children. So it's things like rapid rehousing programs, affordable housing, housing assistance programs in communities. But again, I'm seeing from people chatting in just that there is not enough this affordable housing or options for families and communities. And I don't have to say here, the role of home visitors as crucial to just be that source, that concrete, like protective factor role, and not just home visitors, but any professionals working in the homeless support service sector, being kind of that concrete person that families and children can turn to. But I understand here that still doesn't feel like enough. So Pete, I don't know if you want to turn to.
Yeah, not to push everything off to like state policy, but we do have this challenge in a lot of parts of New York where, and I'm reading everything in the chat, and I think there's some really consistent themes that people are experiencing all over, where there's ways that local departments of social services can get people out of shelters into more permanent housing through ways that they can get more funding from the state for different things without going into all the details of it. But one of the sort of preconditions for that is that the family has to kind of become homeless first, right? And maybe needs to enter the shelter system. Well, that's understandable at one level because of scarce resources and scarce housing. You want to prioritize families who have entered the shelter system, but at the same time, it's creating this problem where a family can only get to that more stable housing if they first go through some really significant instability that can be really harmful for everyone in that family. It's certainly for young children. And so there are different ways we could do that, but that is one key thing that I didn't want to go into too much in detail with my presentation, and really we didn't go into it too much in the report, but there are ways in which doors open up to housing to families once they're into this system, but that's kind of requires two movements, right? A movement out of an apartment or a home that they were in, which is through an eviction or something else, into a shelter. So that's a negative move. And then they're in the shelter for some period of time until they maybe can get into, hopefully quickly, some more permanent housing. Well, that's, even if that ends up with a decent outcome, like the story that we had there, that was not a good experience for Tiana and her family. And so ways to kind of prevent the entry into the shelter in the first place, I think is something that we really need to figure out a way to do better.
Mm-hmm. And as Nikita mentioned, just I don't know if comorbidity is the right word, but the lacking of a stable home creates the greater risk for food insecurity, which can lead to poor health outcomes and developmental delays, and how it's all interconnected. So I think opportunities here, as you were mentioning, Pete, the role that home visitors play, and I know you mentioned the report specific to school-age children, but home visitors are interfacing with families up front when a child is first born, before they're school age, and the role and extent to which home visitors play in supporting parents in kind of creating that foundation of stability, with finding an affordable source of housing or other resources in the community, like connection to SNAP benefits or any other concrete supports that can offset like a cognitive load, if you will. I saw a chat in here just about how rent continues to rise. And we've already highlighted just how tenant protections are unfortunately not great throughout different areas of the state. So ways in which, although rent or affordable housing is a very real challenge for families, other connections to concrete resources that home visitors can work to connect families with.
So what we've also noticed, or what I've also noticed with my program, is we have the home visiting section and then we have the center-based section. So we, for children 18 months and younger, they're home-based, right? And some of these babies are born living at the shelter, right? Mm-hmm. And then they're still there by the time it's time for them to come in the center-based. And that's the only home that they've known. And trying to talk to a mom or a dad or a grandmother about a dental or having a primary care provider or medical home or anything like that is extremely stressful, because a lot of these parents are so focused on, I am stressed. Like, I had a teen mom who had high blood pressure. She had blood pressure high enough for an old 80-year-old man, and she has no history of it. And she didn't have it while she was pregnant, but being in the shelter and having this baby and not being able to provide for her baby was stressing her out that much. So I think that it's a detriment to the health of, you know what I mean? And a lot of these families, okay, so now you're in the shelter and you have your food stamps, but you have nowhere to cook. You can't cook in the shelter. You know what I mean? So you're eating microwave meals, or you're eating the food that the shelter provides, which is dense in nutrient and like in calories, but not always nutritious.
Right.
And it's this cycle. And I I was listening to. I'm one of those active listeners, so it looks like I wasn't paying attention, but I was listening, and it's I hear like, okay, we need the legislators, and we have to have this concrete data to provide so that they can get more resources and stuff. But I don't understand why rents are like landlords and stuff like that. I don't understand how they're able to raise rents so that no one can live there. You know what I mean? Like, so someone else can have a second or third, fourth home. You're raising the rents. You know what I mean? And it's just you're outsourcing the people. And if the people can't live there, then you have no one to work there. And if you have no one to work there, then your city dies. Like it's this. There has to be a healthy balance of, the different layers of people, and they're just pushing them out. And what we've also been noticing recently is because I ask people, you know what I mean, like, how did you end up here? Like, what led you here? Because I just like to see the whole person. Oh, I used to live in New York City, and they gave us a one-way ticket on the Metro North, and we just got off. They told us this is where the resources are. So now we have New York City's houseless population too. So it's very frustrating.
I'm trying to keep up with the chat box here, but without turning too much into having this be a state level policy conversation, just around like high level policy recommendations. We've highlighted some of the challenges in the landscape. And I apologize to you, Nikita. I wish I had concrete answers. And just something we can turn to in terms of this discussion, but I think it's multifaceted and complex. But I did want to open the opportunity to have folks from around the state share. Are there any ways, any concrete ways that you've found, either with families or community-wide, anything that you've found supports that might be helping to move the needle? We're thinking perhaps guaranteed income pilots, if that's happening in any of your communities around the state, or cash assistance. Do any of your particular communities have subsidized housing programs that are very successful or not successful, but present in the community, available for families? I know we had folks chatting in just about the lack of housing, but we were curious to just see. Okay. So it's that it's there, it's still. Thank you for the participation today too, everybody. And Pete, I don't know if there's opportunity here to talk about how some of the other recommendations in the report dovetail with subsidized housing.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky because families with kids are often, I mean, they need more housing, they need bigger, multi-bedroom units, all those kinds of things. And unfortunately, a lot of affordable housing that's being built because of the economics of affordable housing, which I'm not an expert in. I don't want to pretend I am. But if there's a new apartment building going up and they're going to get some kind of tax credit or subsidy to build the affordable housing to ensure that at least folks with modest incomes are able to live in it. Although it's very hard for people with very low incomes to even get into and afford lots of the newer affordable housing that's built. They sort of have to maximize the square footage and the number of units and all those things. And so that ends up resulting in a lot of studios and one bedrooms being built, which is helpful for folks lower income adults, seniors, things like that, who definitely need housing, but it makes it difficult for family housing, right? And and unfortunately, the way the sort of math works of all of this, it's difficult to get decent new affordable housing for families built, particularly in like urban environments and such. And so a lot of the newer affordable housing just isn't really meeting the needs of families with particularly young children, but all children, I think. And then to the same point, I mean, I hear you on all the rising rents, and I know there's differences in all parts of the state around some of this, but there's some pretty consistent themes of the cost of housing is going up everywhere. And yeah, I mean, there are ways we need to ensure that that families who need housing with kids can afford housing, both like from the job that they may have and what they earn to be able to pay for it, and then if that's still too low, that we have enough assistance, whether it's through Section 8 or other things, to help support that. But I would love to just say landlords shouldn't be able to make so much extra money, but like there's no mechanism to do that, right? And so the way we have to do it is through more housing, helping people have certain protections if they get into housing, things like that. In my opinion, people disagree, but it's appealing to better angels can work sometimes, but not usually at the scale that families need it. And it's a real challenge. But I think the fact that this is an issue that's present in every corner of the state. This is not a New York City issue necessarily, though it certainly is there and is often more pronounced there. But I'm looking at the chat, the fact that there's rising rents and people getting priced out of Steuben County, which is a little south of us here in Rochester, is the fact that there are common themes shows that we need to have both community approaches, ways that folks think about these things in their part of the state, and try to get local elected officials or nonprofits to focus on some of this, but statewide issues call for statewide solutions at some level, and so we need lawmakers to do some things.
I wanted to uplift one of the chat box comments just about home visitors this is from Jill, and I think it was so beautifully said. Home visitors get a unique view of the struggle that families face in navigating broken systems and can be a powerful source of witness, info, and ideas. We're providing direct care via implementing agencies that also work on policy and advocacy, but the two objectives are often siloed: direct care and policy. And I think it so beautifully speaks to what we're aiming to do here today. We're just starting the conversation around the direct service that all of you provide by interfacing with families, and the policy level mechanisms that solve these very real issues that are seen every day on the ground. And although these conversations can feel very heavy and that we're talking in circles, and that it's easy to kind of find ourselves just talking about the challenges and the problems, but just the role that your contributions here today and these conversations play to help inform the state level work that's happening, since it's all channeled from what's seen in communities and with families on the ground. So we've been speaking a little bit just about this already, but we wanted to take a moment to just highlight again, which I'm sure most of you know more than I do, but the role that home visitors play and just what you're doing every day with helping to regulate the emotions of children that you work with, and helping parents to understand their child's development and their behavior, what's developmentally appropriate, and thinking of things to support families, which I know all of you do, that are outside of the box, that this chat just explained, how you can be a witness, you can bear witness and listen and do your best to connect families with those supports in communities. And although, I think Pete and I both want to provide the answers to you today, and I'm feeling certainly like this conversation can talk about just all the challenges that families are facing, and it can feel very heavy, but I hope that out of today's session, there's a feeling of just recognizing that all of us are facing this together and brainstorming about how to best support our children and families. Okay.
If I could just say, again, my work, it largely makes me focus on like, what are the big picture policies? What can we fund differently? How can we like change this regulation, things like that. But I've encountered things myself through knowing some people, and the former childcare provider for my kids was experiencing some real housing issues, and she reached out, and I was not the best resource, but I was able to point her in the direction of some people who were really helpful and able to actually keep her, help her figure out a way to catch up on her rent and stay in her apartment with her several young children. And like, so I just want to be clear, like the work that you all do and the ability to do direct advocacy on behalf of individuals is incredibly essential to any sort of path forward for any of this. Like the systems that have been set up either through neglect at times or malice in some instances, like often force families into really difficult situations. And it's people, it's like real people who interact with other people who have the ability to make phone calls and provide guidance to families and answer questions and be advocates and all of that, that ends up saving so many people's lives and situations, and helping them and their kids maintain some sense of stability and connection to one another, and prevent all sorts of things like involvement in the child welfare system and all sorts of things. So ultimately, like, we do a bad job in this country, I think, at like just designing really smooth programs that like people don't, that just benefit people easily. And people, particularly folks who have really struggled in a lot of different parts of life, they need people who can be that resource and that advocate, and creative thinker for how they can move forward and take advantage of some things that may be there for them in the community. And so I just want to, I know, having spoken to some people who've done this work and having worked with a lot of social workers and other folks at different parts of my life, like I know the work can be like incredibly draining and exhausting, and burnout is really high and all that. But like the work that home visitors are doing every day and supporting families is like, it's invaluable work. And just want to thank you all for doing the work you do, and also just recognizing that everyone plays a role, and whether that's people running and meeting with families, running home visitation programs, meeting with families, and folks who are pushing at in Albany for policy changes to support some of this, or pushing for their communities to invest in affordable housing. All these different things, they all play a role because there's like a lot of need out there, and there's a lot of problems that need addressing, and we all have got to contribute our piece to it.
Thank you, Pete. You articulately said what I was trying to say earlier, but I wanted to uplift a chat comment here just about, I think this speaks to the thinking outside the box, trying to negotiate with landlords to see if they'll accept alternative forms of payment from an agency instead of cash for a security deposit. So examples like that, thank you for chatting that in, this kind of cross-sharing opportunity. Hopefully it's successful, but ideas like that throughout the state to support families are invaluable. When creating these slides, I collaborated with one of our staff members here who heads up the training and staff development for Healthy Families New York. And to close us out, because we are coming up 4 minutes before the end, before I do that, actually, please chat in any other questions you have. I do have an end slide with our contact information as well. If you'd like to send us an email, and this in no way is an end to the conversation. I think we'd like to continue it and hear from you and hear your ideas. However, we did just want to put up a little slide here to just say that we know these issues are real and hard not to hold on to, particularly for all of us as home visitors and early childhood advocates. We know we all care so much about this work, which is why most of us are here today having this conversation. But you do play a crucial role in empowering parents. That is your role, to empower and identify what you can to minimize the impacts of housing instability. You play a role in connecting to resources, legal, housing, emergency services, but while remembering that to the extent we can to stay out of fix-it mode, and everyone in this profession, as I just said, cares so deeply, but sometimes the lines can be a little blurred. So remembering a little slide here to just acknowledge remembering to maintain boundaries and take care of ourselves too, on the path to alleviating stressors for children and families. I'll put up our contact information here. Is there any closing remarks you have, Pete, other than thank you very much for all the work you do for families and children? We would like to continue the conversation. Thank you for sharing and having this dialogue with us today and just speaking about what's happening in other areas of the state.
No, no closing remarks. Just thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate everyone's interest and attention and everything else.
We will be following up via email with the slide deck with a link to the report, information about other upcoming webinars, but please, I don't know where our emails went. Please keep in touch. Thank you for attending today. Thank you for your participation. And thank you so much. We look forward to the next webinar. Thank you. And thank you to Pete and to Shannon as well. I did not see that you joined, and thank you very much for joining and all the work that you've done on this report. Bye, everyone. Thank you.